So, LordImmolation, I really think that your theory of how our consciousness perceives time is really close to my theory of time and how I try to describe time itself. Um, I'm gonna try to put what you said in different words here and see if it corresponds. So let me know if what I think is right. So the way I see it is like if it were a program, our perceptions would be like multiple threads within the program, which are all updating static variables. And then our consciousness would be like the application driver, which would read those static variables and send them to output threads. So there's a lot of processes happening at the same time, which are all constantly updating our total perception. And so our total perception isn't of a single point in time, but as a segment in time that we perceive of as a point. And I really think that that's close to my theory of time. The way I define time is with temporal objects. And temporal object is made up of temporal parts. I use Ted Sider's theory of temporal parts for the most part, which is which describes the movement that an object makes in space between two states to go from one state to another. And so I define temporal objects as being the grouping of a grouping of temporal parts which concern objects which are all moving the same. They're all moving together. And so the temporal object doesn't actually contain any information about the object itself. It just contains starting points and ending points of the points in space for and time for each temporal part. So it doesn't describe the shape of the object or really anything about the object, because the object cannot exist within a point. But it can describe the points that it starts in space and ends in space, which is all moving together. And so then we can start to describe the shape of the object and attributes about that object by comparing a temporal object to the temporal objects which surround it. So the way I would see perception is working is that we are constantly perceiving temporal objects, and our consciousness is basically the process of relating these temporal objects to each other and combining them so that we combining them into a single thing which we can call our consciousness, which we call our mind, which is perceiving the group of perceptions that we have in our senses. So the implications that this would have on the idea of the consciousness of time would be things like it would be able to explain why time flies when you're happy and time goes slowly when you're bored or in pain, because when you're happy you're you're focusing on less perceptions. Your consciousness is paying attention to less perceptions, and so it's not it doesn't have to group as many together, and so the amount of time that we conceive of as the present actually grows. And when we're paying attention to specific, not specific, but when we're paying attention to a large amount of perceptions or constantly changing perceptions, then it would make the make the amount of time that our consciousness would have to group all these things together shorter, and so our perception of the present would be a shorter amount of time, and so it would move more slowly through time. Which is not to say that we're moving more slowly through time, simply that we're grouping things together at in a shorter period of time, so it takes longer for us to group them together. So yeah, that's my basic ideas. The one thing that I'm trying to work on now, and the way I describe why we experience the present at a certain point in time, because I don't believe that the present is arbitrary. I believe that we are perceiving changes in the temporal objects, and so time itself is constantly changing and updating. And so our perception of the present would be how we are our reactions to changes in the timeline. But I'm curious as to how you see perception of the present and how to try to define where the present is in time, assuming that determinism is true to at least a basic extent.